the Golden Dawn, the Ordo Templi Orientis, OTO, the Varius Rosicrucian orders and countless other brotherhoods of the 20th century, e.g., the Adonis Alliance, the Argentium Astrum, A. The Servants of the Light, Sol, the various Bardon alliances, and of course the Fraternitas Saturni, FS. Let them all be mentioned here on behalf of the countless others which are not. Looking at things this way, it may seem as though practical money magic has been virtually non-existent throughout history. Where the theoretical analysis of this magical domain is concerned, that C.E.R. Toynbee holds true. By the way, the magic of the East is in a similar predicament regarding its own literature. It too reveals a gaping abyss in its documentation of money magic, especially if you disregard the good luck spells bore road from folk magic that comprise just a tiny portion of its multifaceted practice. Supposing that magic is not what its adversaries make it out to be, ineffective, compensatory acts performed by naive megalomaniacs and or immature children who are lagging in their development, and is instead viewed as a verifiable art that has been practiced in every culture throughout the ages and is still practiced today, it would be plausible to conclude that such a long-lasting practice would not have been possible in the first place had it been nothing but an unrealistic delusion. In simple terms, one could say that if magic didn't work at all, it would have died out long ago. The adverse objection that a collective delusion doesn't prove the existence of factual reality holds no ground. After all, it is my opinion that, unlike blind faith, obtaining verifiable results is exactly what magic sets out to do, regardless of the fact that fault may be found with its customary methods of supplying such evidence. So if you comb through the vast amounts of magical literature out there looking for information on practical money magic, you'll rarely have any luck. Any kind of systematic treatment of the subject is utterly impossible to find, and although a few tidbits of information might be scattered here and there, these will often be tainted by moral preaching and threats of the consequences of misuse, unfortunately quite commonplace in older documents on magic. The reasons why such information is so sparse cannot be discussed here in depth without greatly diverging from the focus of this book. Nonetheless, a few of explanations will be mentioned here at times where they relate directly to our magical practice. As you'll see, the explanations often involve the obstacles and other hurdles preventing magical success that we as money magicians must overcome if we ever want to achieve any kind of tangible results. To begin, let's have a look at how money has been universally categorized throughout the history of Western magic. Since the time of the pre-Socratic. For introduction. Empedocles, the doctrine of the maintained as the fundamental mystical concepts in Western Civili doctrine of elements cannot be sued in history sufficiently enough to tradition. It has nevertheless played that is still acknowledged today. The elements are described serve as both a short introduction to refresh the memories of the magicians. This in turn will lead us cold problem in practical money shortly. The term element is not used specific substance as it is in modern, it's more a metaphysical concept, mixture of effectiveness, power, basic structure. The element of FR. The element of fire describes the force, dynamic force, and life force. Counterpart, it's highly active. It Cree 11,111 destroying the old. It consumes to drives forward that which would. In a spiritual context, it stands for an aggression. Point 1. L. Part 1. Mon is at 51. Less than OOEOUJD say that if magic didn't L, E died out long ago. The adverse LK, ill, T, E delusion doesn't prove them. R. Ality holds no ground. After all, unlike blind faith, obtaining COCT1Y what magic sets out to do, that fault may be found with its of supplying such evidence. Through the vast amounts of magi, they're looking for information on you'll rarely have any luck. Any treatment of the subject is utterly, and although a few tidbits of info, JF, added here and there, these will LLTJ moral preaching and threats of the focus of CLCSS. A few of explanations will be times where they relate directly to. As you'll see, the explanations LLLLBST, aids and other hurdles prevent that we as money magicians must want to achieve any kind of tans. Have a look at how money has categorized throughout the history. Since the time of the pre-Socratic. Empedocles, the doctrine of the elements has been maintained as the fundamental matrix of all magical mystical concepts in Western civilization. Even if the doctrine of elements cannot be substantiated in mundane history sufficiently enough to call it an unbroken tradition, it has nevertheless played a significant role that is still acknowledged today. The elements are described in brief below to serve as both a short introduction for beginners and to refresh the memories of the more experienced magicians. This in turn will lead us to the most difficult problem in practical money magic, as we will see shortly. The term element is not used here to describe a specific substance as it is in modern chemistry. Instead, it's more a metaphysical concept. Element refers to a mixture of effectiveness, power, sequential events, and basic structure. The element of fire. The element of fire describes the principles of driving force, dynamic force, and life force. Just like its physical counterpart, it's highly active. It creates the new while destroying the old, it consumes to generate heat, and it drives forward that which would otherwise stagnate. In a spiritual context, it stands for motivation, activity, and aggression. Part L. Money in. T.S. True Element 5. The element of water. Water describes the flowy G of motion. It is adaptable and flexible without having a fixed form, but it assumes the form of every container that holds it. It nourishes the life ignited by fire, cleanses and rinses away the old and the decaying, yet can yield a significant amount of its own destructive power when unleashed in vast quantities. In a spiritual context, it stands for feelings, sensitivity, and visionary reflection. It separates more than it unites and corresponds to intuition and clairvoyance. The element of air. The element of air is volatile and cannot be captured in a solid form. Its flexibility allows it to change locations at will. At the same time, it sustains life, feeds the flame of fire, and forms the link between the old and the new or unknown. In a spiritual context, it stands for thought and logic, which operate analytically instead of synthetically, as water does. Thus, it makes clear distinctions between things and gives them names, which is why language and speech are attributed to this element. The element of earth. The element of earth represents firmness and sandability, the constant form, the basic structure of every shape, and the qualities of endurance, steadfastness, and dependability. In a spiritual context, it stands for 6. Introduction. The fixed form, tenacity, in its stubbornness, perseverance, and be described as solid and tangible, material and factual worlds. The element of E. The element of ether is often and it historically joined the fairly late date. It stands for material world, for spiritually higher principles of all kinds, ones. In a spiritual context, it caudial in a metaphysical or religious calling, and access to the TRA, NSCC 8111 form of inner divinity or spiritual. Elemental. Using the fundamental structure, magical tradition is able to 3 characters, the world in all its detailed proportion of the elements to odd greater than changeability in each instance are gil. For example, a dominant, applied to certain situations, where the factors of dynamic F painful change and ruthless self. The water element on the to certain situations, persons, or emotions, intuition, and subda 01, I. Part 1. Money is R1 the flowing of motion. It is adapt without having a FTXED form, but it lorem of every container that holds it. It life ignited by fire, cleanses and rinses in the decaying, yet can yield a sig T of its own destructive power when FTST quantities. In a spiritual context, it lil GS, sensitivity, and visionary reflection. More than it unites and corresponds to clairvoyance. The element of air. Of air is volatile and cannot be captured. Its flexibility allows it to change loca. At the same time, it sustains life, feeds, FUE, and forms the link between the new or unknown. In a spiritual context, thought and logic, which operate ana synthetically, as water does. Thus, distinctions between things and gives, which is why language and speech are this element. Of earth represents firmness and santa, DS1 tant form, the basic structure of every qualities of endurance, steadfastness, ILITY. In a spiritual context, it stands for the FTXED form, tenacity, in its extreme form, even stubbornness, perseverance, and everything that can be described as solid and tangible, which includes the material and factual worlds. The element of ether, spirit. The element of ether is often called spirit as well, and it historically joined the group of elements at a fairly late date. It stands for everything beyond the material world, for spiritually subtle energies, and for higher principles of all kinds, including transpersonal ones. In a spiritual context, it corresponds to the soul in a metaphysical or religious mystical sense, a higher calling, and access to the transcendental realm in the form of inner divinity or spiritual transcendence. Elemental aspects. Using the fundamental structure the elements create, magical tradition is able to describe and categorize the world in all its detailed aspects. In doing so, the proportion of the elements to one another and their changeability in each instance are of great significance. For example, a dominance of the fire element is applied to certain situations, persons, or circumstances where the factors of dynamic force, fast and, often, painful change, and ruthless self-assertion prevail. The water element, on the other hand, is applied to certain situations, persons, or circumstances where emotions, intuition, and subtle or subliminal energies that are rarely perceptible on the surface are characteristic. An excess of the water element might be expressed as sentimentality or emotional turmoil that may in turn lead to irrational behavior. Rationalism, which itself would be attributed to the earth element, would be impossible with excess water qualities. A characteristically airy person would to Pi Kali be an intellectualist or thinker who relies more on rational intelligence than on emotions, and might therefore seem a bit theoretical at times. Earthy people, on the other hand, value everything that is concrete and physical. They would be characterized as practical as opposed to theoreticians, or as craftspeople instead of philosophers. Earthy people waste no time in getting things done, and have little sense for subliminal or delicate matters. This short introduction to the elements should suffice for now, and later on it will be covered more thoroughly when money's classification is discussed. Although the elements represent or describe fundamental principles, it's important to remember that within a magical tradition, they always interact with one another in close conjunction. In other words, no single phenomenon in the entire universe is the embodiment of one single element. Instead, everything is composed of a combination of all elements together in varying amounts. In the magical doctrine of correspondences or signatures, the various classifications are compiled into 8. Introduction. Systematic tables. In doing so, other often applied as well, such as the signs of the zodiac, the paths, tree of life, and so on. In this dais of symbols have been created less than L, which is probably Liber 777 by B. Crowley, which he developed older draft version written by his Alan Bennett, that was finally PUUUIII. 2. I revs 10 nanoseconds. Similar to the way astrology of the planetary principles, signs aftotary aspects, and other related SVMY world, the Hermetic magician in the correspondences to shape ritual plays a significant role in our correct classification of Mon JII_. Elements, since this in turn generate J. Magical procedure to be used. Before we can investigate the detail, we need to examine another that illustrates this process quite whereby we're more interested in, rather than the 22 trump. Major Arcana. The 56 cards are divided into 4 suits, just of cards, which actually originally tarot, swords, wands, cups, and was also often referred to as discs I. J. Part 1. Monet is 1 LLLBK. The surface or Chirac THC water element might be L FLIL LBLLI 1 to F. O pound emotional turmoil that U excess water qualities. Airy, person would to Pi, est or thinker who relies more or delicate matters. Cession to the elements should make version S classification is discussed. Represent or describe funda, S important to remember that conjunction. In other words, in the entire universe is the E element. Instead, everything LLLLL vertation of all elements together and an NNA of correspondences or SIG classifications are compiled into systematic tables. In doing so, other basic schemes are often applied as well, such as the planetary principles, the signs of the zodiac, the paths of the Kabbalistic tree of life, and so on. In this way, entire encyclopedias of symbols have been created, the most popular of which is probably Liber 777 by British magician Aleister Crowley, which he developed on the basis of an older draft version written by his mentor and friend Alan Bennett that was finally published after countless revisions. Similar to the way astrology uses the symbolism of the planetary principles, signs of the zodiac, planetary aspects, and other related symbols to describe the world, the Hermetic magician in particular likes to use the correspondences to shape ritual practice. This fact plays a significant role in our context when it comes to the correct classification of money in relation to the elements, since this in turn generally determines the magical procedure to be used. Before we can investigate the classification in more detail, we need to examine another system of symbols that illustrates this process quite well, the tarot cards, whereby we're more interested in the minor arcana rather than the 22 trump cards, adu, of the major arcana. The 56 cards of the minor arcana are divided into 4 suits, just like an ordinary deck of cards, which actually originally developed from the tarot, swords, wands, cups, and coins. The latter was also often referred to as discs or pentacles in the 20th century. There's no need at this point to go into the complicated history of tarot cards, since there are plenty of useful books available on this subject. The only thing that should interest us here is that these 4 suits are assigned to the elements as follows. Swords equals air, wands equals fire, cups equals water, coins equals earth. This allocation of the suits to the elements is documented back to the 19th century and is still used in this form today, for example by the Order of the Golden Dawn. Even Aleister Crowley's tarot deck, the so-called Book of Thoth, that was developed in the 1940s together with the painter Lady Frida Harris, assigns the suit of coins to the element of earth. This probably applies to 99% of all modern versions of the tarot today. One noteworthy exception is Papus, a French occultist and magician, who has virtually fallen into oblivion outside the Francophone world. Papus was the pupil and magical successor of Eliphas Levi, experienced his heyday during the turn of the 19th to 20th century when he assumed a crucial position in France and in the Russian Tsar's court. In his book Tarot of the Bohemians, he surprisingly assigns the coins to the element of air. As we all know, when using any type of symbolic system, the allocation of the images and glyphs used is in no way absolute or objective. So too do all Western disciplines that fall under the category of occultism or esotericism deal with symbolic systems. Whether you introduction, look at medieval alchemy or of astrology, Rosicrucianism, or express fundamental facts of images and symbols outrediti, they're back in time, of course, if plus of Hellenistic Gnosis or Ansel LLLL. Though characteristics meant may not be randomly nonetheless considerable j. Their weighting and correspond. Much of this malleability is in Eli, and depends on a person's likes and dislikes, as well as. After all, such is what deed individual sees as being due situation, or person. Here is where magical theology from rational science, while establishing conceptual occurring contradictions, goes in an entirely different type. Factors are taken into the symbolism must also integral tivity, because only in this way tion be made between the two. Initially seen in our modem science and technology. After defined borders of science and occurs no need at this point to go history of tarot cards, since there are books available on this subject. The old interest is here is that these 4 to the dements as follows: swords equals cups equals water, coins equals earth. Of the suits to the elements is the 19th century and is still today, for example by the order of. Even Aleister Crowley's tarot deck K of Thoth, that was developed in with the painter Lady Frida Harris. Coins to the element of earth. This 99% of all modern versions of Y exception is Papus, a French Chian, who has virtually fallen into the Francophone world. Papus was imp. Al's successor of Eliphas Levi, XP during the turn of the 19th HHV, when he assumed a crucial posy in the Russian Tsar's court. In his Bohemians, he surprisingly assigns the TOF air, when using any type of symbolic N of the images and glyphs used as are objective. So too do all Western under the category of occultism or with symbolic systems. Whether you look at medieval alchemy or the symbolic languages of astrology, Rosicrucianism, or Freemasonry, they all express fundamental facts of metaphysical nature in images and symbols, a tradition that reaches even further back in time, of course, if we consider the exemplars of Hellenistic Gnosis or ancient Egyptian magic. Though characteristics and features of the elements may not be randomly interchangeable, there is nonetheless considerable leeway when determining their weighting and corresponding ratio of dominance. Much of this malleability is in the eye of the beholder and depends on a person's level of development and likes and dislikes, as well as strengths and weaknesses. After all, such is what determines which element an individual sees as being dominant in a certain event, situation, or person. Here's where magical thought radically diverges from rational science. While science is concerned with establishing conceptual clarity and eliminating any occurring contradictions whatsoever, magical thought goes in an entirely different direction. Although objective factors are taken into consideration here as well, the symbolism must also integrate an observer's subjectivity, because only in this way can a resilient connection be made between the two. Indeed, this marriage is not as unusual as it may initially seem in our modern-day world, dominated by science and technology. After all, beyond the clearly defined borders of science and technology, we humans. Part 1. Money in its true element. I generally still behave the same as we always have for the last tens of thousands of years. We perceive the outside world in relation to ourselves, for example by taking a clear position on issues, by being drawn towards certain things or away from others, through emotional reactions, and the judgment of values. Here's a short example to illustrate this point. The beach. Imagine an ocean scene with a sunny beach. There are people swimming and splashing around in the water. Some are basking in the sun or sitting under the shade of colorful parasols. Others might be sitting at the bar or taking a stroll, and some might be building a sand castle or tossing a colorful beach ball. Let's examine 4 individuals from this specific scene. Our first object of observation is a slim, darkly tanned man in his mid-30s, dressed in short swimming trunks, playing beach soccer with a group of kids. He's performing all of the functions of a coach. He gives instructions, kicks the ball to various players, cheers them on with great enthusiasm, shouts a few encouraging words to the goalkeeper, and exudes a sense of energy, activity, and love of action. It's obvious that he sincerely loves what he's doing. He likes fast action, he masters the ball with fancy footwork, and seems to have an abundance of energy, at least for the moment. Expressed in the symbolism of the elements, one would expect this scene to be strongly dominated by 12. Introduction. Fire. The heat of the blazing sun, activity, the desire to achieve in competition, and the use of fizzle, all characteristics that correspond to the definition of this element. Now let's look at a woman in dur and tan, wearing a bikini, her top of her head, standing at the small flock of male admirers. Bubbly, her gestures and facial 3. Quent, she laughs frequently and talks much more than her calm, yet shows an interest in what I questions, makes comments, and engrossed in this lively communa. Subjectively speaking, the S1 dominate this scene. The X, speech, the receptiveness to foe, integration into one's personal hearted joking around, the use of expression, and the domination of MD1 Kate Ayres presence. Next we'll take a look at an Abley in her late 50s, sitting alone _E Jill. Else on her beach towel with her knees hugged tighty to her closely, we'll see her body quivering. As a group of people whom 5 characters tries to approach her, she waves 1. Part 1. Money 2. It's JLLIR, the same as we always have for DS of years. We perceive the out to ourselves, for example by talk on issues, by being drawn toward from others, through emotional judgment of values. Here's a short this point. With a sunny beach. There are splashing around in the water, the sun are sitting under the shade, others might be sitting at the bar, some might be building a sand lol or fui beach ball. Individuals from this specific of observation is a slim, darkly 30s, dressed in short swim beach soccer with a group of kids. Of the functions of a coach, he gives enthusiasm, shouts a few encourage goalkeeper, and exudes a sense of love of action. He sincerely loves what he's doing. He masters the ball with fancy to have an abundance of energy, symbolism of the elements, one seen to be strongly dominated by fire, the heat of the blazing sun, the intense physical activity, the desire to achieve and perform, the sense of competition, and the use of physical reserves. These are all characteristics that correspond to the above definition of this element. Now let's look at a woman in her early 40s, slender and tan, wearing a bikini, her sunglasses pushed on top of her head, standing at the bar conversing with a small flock of male admirers. She's obviously quite bubbly, her gestures and facial expressions are eloquent, She laughs frequently and flashes a toothy smile, talks much more than her companions, jokes around, yet shows an interest in what others have to say, asks questions, makes comments, and overall seems to be engrossed in this lively communication. Subjectively speaking, the element of air seems to dominate this scene. The exchange of ideas through speech, the receptiveness to foreign ideas and their integration into one's personal reflections, the light-hearted joking around, the use of gestures and facial expressions, and the domination of communication all indicate air's presence. Next, we'll take a look at another woman, probably in her late 50s, sitting alone, apart from everyone else on her beach towel with her forehead resting on her knees hugged tightly to her chest. If we look more closely, we'll see her body quivering at times. She's crying. As a group of people whom she obviously knows tries to approach her, she waves them off, signaling. Part L. Money in its true element 13, that she doesn't want to be disturbed. The situation is perfectly clear. The woman is troubled, not doing well, and she apparently cannot control her fits of crying, or maybe she doesn't really want to. Here we can see the element of water at work, the strong display of emotions that makes any type of communication impossible, as opposed to the other woman we observed, the self-centeredness, the apparent dwelling on personal pain, and lack of willingness to open up to contact with others all characterize this element. Finally, let's observe an older man estimated to be in his late 50s who is also sitting alone away from the hustle and bustle under the awning of the bar. A laptop is on the table in front of him and he's holding a cell phone to one ear with his left hand. While talking, he keeps looking at the computer screen showing a spreadsheet with rows and columns of numbers. He occasionally types something with his right hand. An open notebook and a pen are lying on the table next to the computer, and leaning against the table leg is a half-opened briefcase with business papers sticking out of it. The scene says it all. The man is working and not enjoying himself like most other people at this vacation spot. Instead, he's looking at calculations, seemingly unaware of the beach, ocean, sun, and the other people there. His full attention is tuned to the conversation with his business partner. I-4 Introduction. This scene appears quite earthy. Focus on his work, the self-disky JJII. Let's not forget that this SLFTT, L described above, is merely a single moment in time. In RIRJ, I, Stanley moving and changing, and CR athletic soccer player D, responding to the peace and Earth, the talkative lady at the be swimming out in the ocean, aimed to get in her daily round of the woman who was depressed perk up, at least enough to start. Tion with a girlfriend, all the. Shinali, water, yet quite ch. Expressed as still water, but in. Businessman may put as, the. Game of cards with three other. Joke after another, air. 1. Money in Saucel 1 fluid. Let's leave the scene behind us illusions from what we've compelled to broaden its horizons augment of quantum physics 3 characters I that the nature of many things is. Part, Mosin OS 1T to be disturbed. The situation is woman is troubled, not doing well, cannot control her fits of crying, or really want to. See the element of water at work, of emotions that makes any type of possible, as opposed to the other, the self-centeredness, the apar fusional pain, and lack of willingness with others all characterize this lil LHC. An older man estimated to be who is also sitting alone away from under the awning of the bar. In front of him and he's holding car with his left hand. While talk at the computer screen showing rows and columns of numbers, he something with his right hand. And a pen are lying on the table next leaning against the table leg as with business papers sticking out at all. The man is working and not most other people at this vacation looking at calculations, seemingly, ocean, sun, and the other people Tion is tuned to the conversation. If someone were to ask him, he would admit that this scene appears quite earthy. The high degree of focus on his work, the self-discipline required to concentrate on his job in a recreational spot without being in the least distracted, all of these are characteristic of the element of earth as described earlier. Let's not forget that this scene, as with all others described above, is merely a snapshot that captures a single moment in time. In reality, everything is constantly moving and changing. An hour later, we might see our athletic soccer player dozing in the sun, corresponding to the peace and calm of the element of Earth. The talkative lady at the bar might meanwhile be swimming out in the ocean, energetically, fire, trying to get in her daily round of exercise. The mood of the woman who was depressed and crying may later perk up, at least enough to start an engrossing conversation with a girlfriend, all the while gesticulating emotionally, water, yet quite cheerfully. Here, the element expressed is still water, but in another quality. And our businessman may put aside his work to play a merry game of cards with 3 other vacationers, cracking one joke after another, air. Money in society. Let's leave the scene behind us now to draw a few conclusions from what we've observed. Science has been compelled to broaden its horizons ever since the development of quantum physics, for example, to accept that the nature of many things is not as clearly outlined and static as Newtonian physics and mechanics have led us to believe for centuries. Nonetheless, science's key objective has always been to unlock the secrets of nature and categorize them according to closely defined, inherent laws that apply without exception. Contradictions and vagueness are undesired, as are any indications of ambivalence, and in cases of doubt, small elements are torn out of context and observed in isolation. As our example clearly shows, the concept of the elements is a system of categorization that not only takes the dynamics of everything into consideration, but also attempts to grasp the protagonist's subjective state of mind while in the midst of permanent change. Keeping all this in mind, I would like to delve into the historical categorization of money and the prevailing cultural attitudes toward it. Money as we know it today has had quite a turbulent past. Throughout the history of civilization, man has given money various forms and functions, a few of which I would like to examine here. For a long time, researchers have assumed that the so-called convention theory was sufficient to describe the origin and evolution of money. According to this theory, money is merely an intermediary object of exchange whose function is to enable the exchange of other objects that are less mobile. This prevents heavy or bulky traded goods from having to be transported each time over long distances while giving the trading partner an adequate item of equivalent value. 4.16 Introduction. Example, instead of bringing a bricks to a farmer in order to trade in eggs, and then later to Anyo for wood and tools to build a S, can be greatly simplified with the services, which do not require ownership, can also be gauged with money. Money itself can take on the from the gold nuggets of miners, from precious metals, to handry promissory notes, IOUs, or the machine safe and supposedly F banknotes used today in Australia, J. Of course, the convention theory as everyday life shows, but it D to the history of money. Anthropol dense of advertising and dignity value that were openly displayed to underline an individual's social soma. Of Yap, a Micronesian island in the Dali referred to this as show-off discs of stone measuring several in the indigenous culture, fulfilled publicly displaying an owner's and worldly influence. The men, humongous show-off coins were way too large and immobile to alar basis. Par less than El Mosin. Nien physics and mechanics have vagueness or undesired, as are any ends, and in cases of doubt, small of context and observed in isolation. Clearly shows the concept of categorization that not only of everything into consideration. 1D grasp the protagonist's subjective in the midst of permanent change. In mind, I would like to delve into 111. 01 Tion of money and the prevail toward it. Bawid today has had quite a turbulent the history of civilization, man LT-LRARI as forms and functions, a few of to examine here. Theory was sufficient to describe Tion of money. According to this merely an intermediary object of e.g. CTI, on is to enable the exchange of our less mobile. This prevents heavy PXTS from having to be transported distances while giving the trad LLLB1 to it item of equivalent value. For example, instead of bringing a cart loaded with heavy bricks to a farmer in order to trade them there for grain and eggs, and then later to another place in exchange for wood and tools to build a shed, such transactions can be greatly simplified with the transfer of money. Services, which do not require that an object changes ownership, can also be gauged and offset more easily with money. Money itself can take on the most varied forms. From the gold nuggets of miners and coins minted from precious metals, to handwritten and hand-signed promissory notes, IOUs, or the colorful, washing machine safe and supposedly forgery-proof plastic banknotes used today in Australia. Of course, the convention theory is basically correct, as everyday life shows, but it doesn't really do justice to the history of money. Anthropology had early evidence of advertising and dignity money, objects of value that were openly displayed to attract mates or to underline an individual's social status. Scientific records of Yap, a Micronesian island in the South Pacific offie. Daly referred to this as show-off money, huge round discs of stone measuring several feet in diameter that, in the indigenous culture, fulfilled the sole purpose of publicly displaying an owner's wealth, social standing, and worldly influence. The mere existence of these humongous show-off coins was enough. After all, they were way too large and immobile to be traded on a regular basis. Such forms of money were only temporary in his Tory, and soon the type of money we're familiar with today came into being. MTER all, money has to be mobile, and above all it has to be made of a material that's not so easy to procure, whether it's cowrie shells, silver, or gold. Only materials that are fairly rare or difficult to procure can ensure that money maintains a certain value, which has nothing to do with the physical size or weight of the actual materials used. On the other hand, materials that are widespread and generally available such as leaves, sand, or pebbles would not function well in an economical sense, as the economy we are familiar with requires a constant shortage of resources to function well. Accordingly, parallel to developing a settled way of life, humans established the value system that still exists today. Precious metals and jewels and owning property form the basis of a universal economic system. Trades and swaps still take place today, although the modern methods of doing so have become faster and more efficient due to advances in business and technology. While early humans may have found it difficult to grasp the abstract concept that money represented, we of the modern age are quite comfortable with settling a great deal of monetary transactions, particularly international ones, by merely transferring data. Actual physical, material money no longer plays a significant role. I.e. Introduction. But that's a fairly modern devdavo possible until late into the 20 less than late as the 1930s. All major currency significant countries were reinforced CS metals. Gold and silver are stored for this purpose. Storage of affected nation states having per £0 31111. Private citizens, on the other hand, asserted their wealth in a more NER. Although the ownership of preserved and similar rare goods still plagued the accumulation of real estate position. Property, leasehold rights, through the cultivation of farmwool woodland was understood as true 20th century, while the possessal penny shares in the form of stocks, and the like was generally granted status. In our study of money magic, focus our attention on the concept AFJ, ring both naturally and artificially, as since this is the key factor that difficulties that we encounter in, as we will soon see. 1. Modum adi. With the spread of Christianity, a life entered the picture, one that, hostile to everything material and panai, monet less than sin. Why only temporary in his of money we're familiar with all. Money has to be mobile, made of a material that's not its cowrie shells, silver, or a fairly rare or difficult to money maintains a certain to do with the physical size or lultals used. On the other hand, FLLTIL, LL and generally available lane utils would not function well as the economy we are familiar shortage of resources to functo developing a settled way, bed the value system that still metals and jewels in owning. R. 1 NCES in business and techno may have found it difficult to that money represented, we quite comfortable with settling transactions, particularly merely transferring data. Actual no longer plays a significant. But that's a fairly modern development that wasn't possible until late into the 20th century. Even as late as the 1930s, all major currencies of economically significant countries were reinforced by reserves of precious metals. Gold and silver reserves especially were stored for this purpose. Storage of these metals directly affected nation states having prerogative of coinage. Private citizens, on the other hand, usually defined and asserted their wealth in a more sophisticated manner. Although the ownership of precious metals, jewels, and similar rare goods still played a significant role, the accumulation of real estate took over the leading position. Property, leasehold rights, and money earned through the cultivation of farmland, pastures, and woodland was understood as true wealth up into the 20th century, while the possession of money, penny shares in the form of stocks, trademarks, patents, and the like was generally granted a mere secondary status. In our study of money magic, however, we need to focus our attention on the concept of shortage, occurring both naturally and artificially, as mentioned above, since this is the key factor that causes the obstacles and difficulties that we encounter in practical money magic, as we will soon see. Modern attitudes. With the spread of Christianity, a new philosophy of life entered the picture, one that is fundamentally hostile to everything material and worldly. This outlook has prevailed for a very long time, and its repercussions can still be felt today. Of course, the upper echelons of society in every era have always mastered the art of sugar-coating the conditions of poverty and deprivation that prevailed among those they ruled, while at the same time they used their status and influence to snatch up every last tidbit for themselves that they could squeeze out of the community. After all, there was good reason for the dissident voices in the Christianity of the Middle Ages, which was still in its infancy. A large part of both the lower clergy and laymen alike were quick to point out the fundamental contradiction between the poverty, modesty, and the virtue of owning no possessions that was preached, and the actual living standards of the higher clergy and nobility. Countless reforms and heretical movements resulted from this wide gap between the ideal and actual situation for many centuries. Even Protestantism had its Puritan and ascetic movements, some, but not all, of which declared real possessions and the despicable pursuit of money to be a devilish faux pas of humanity that needed to be controlled at all costs in the interest of salvation. Thus, Western civilization has been plagued by a fundamental contradiction since the domination of Christianity. On the one hand, religion focuses exclusively on the fate of the soul after the death of the physical body. The accumulation of material goods is 20 Introduction. Therefore viewed as a dangerous to earth at the risk of eternal damnation. On the other hand, business, both Christian and non-Christian usual worldly ways, striving for with the goal of becoming real ally at the expense of the less faux eddy, the unfolding of an ideology of this one that preaches merriment, ill with a focus on profit and incest all LFJ dominates every economic runs quite contrary to the spiritual life on earth and its materialistic. This results in a conflict for ecological makeup of Western clearly present today, despite Western countries, supposed the background. Money and profit with persistent regularity, or a great suspicion, but our cons ranks money among man's most viewed as a guarantee for pound cal life. This results in the devclaw gives a unique touch to this VI call. Is in essence quite maddening. However, it's not our intention one. Part L Mo in one a very long time, and its repercussions today. Of course, the upper echelons, era, have always mastered the art the conditions of poverty and depried among those they ruled, while they used their status and influence tier last tidbit for themselves that they out of the community. After all, they're for the dissident voices in the Christie ages, which was still in its infancy. Of both the lower clergy and laymen to point out the fundamental contra the poverty, modesty, and the virtue possessions that was preached, in the LLDA.RDS of the higher clergy and nobility. And heretical movements resulted a P between the ideal and actual situa. JIICS1. Antism had its Puritan and ascetic, but not all of which declared mate in the despicable pursuit of money to paw of humanity that needed to be costs in the interest of salvation. Leyland civilization has been plagued by contradiction since the domination of the one hand. Religion focuses exclude and tay of the soul after the death of the accumulation of material goods is therefore viewed as a dangerous game that binds man to earth at the risk of eternal damnation. On the other hand, business, society, and politics in both Christian and non-Christian cultures pursue their usual worldly ways, striving for material possessions with the goal of becoming wealthy and affluent, USU ally at the expense of the less fortunate classes of society. The unfolding of an ideology that results because of this one that preaches mercantilism and capitalism with a focus on profit and incessant expansion that is known today as economic growth, a term that still dominates every economic conversation. All of this runs quite contrary to the spiritual condemnation of life on earth and its materialistic temptations. This results in a conflict for the collective psychological makeup of Western man, a conflict still clearly present today, despite religions, at least in Western countries, supposed movement further into the background. Money and profit are still condemned with persistent regularity, or are at least viewed with great suspicion, but our consumer-oriented society ranks money among man's most important needs. It's viewed as a guarantee for safeguarding one's physical life. This results in the development of a situation where everything becomes centered around money. Of course, the biography of each individual always gives a unique touch to this collective conflict, which is in essence quite maddening. Just as with statistics, however, it's not our intention to analyze individual. Part 1. Money in its true element 2 I cases here. Instead, we're concerned with trends that affect society as a whole, ones that the individual could at best only avoid or escape here and there, but never entirely. Modern magic. Such trends naturally affect the magician as well. And although consideration of this fact is often purposely avoided in the magic scene, each and every magician is first and foremost a product of the society in which he lives. Whether we like it or not, we've all internalized our share of collective consciousness. Psychologically speaking, we could also say that prevailing values and taboos influence the magician just as they influence non-magical individuals. Although the degree of this influence varies naturally from case to case, it nonetheless forms the overall backdrop for every magical act. Mitigating factors such as our mores and taboos can always be clearly seen wherever society or human relations are concerned. In particular, three core areas of the magical tradition are affected by such influences: healing, sex magic, and as already mentioned, money magic. In all three areas of concern, no practitioner works in a vacuum. The magician has to relate with other people and is therefore affected by their social reflexes as well as the magician's own. Accordingly, the magician should be aware of this and not try to avoid critical analysis by escaping into vague, insignificant, metaphysical explanations. The old, ironical saying, "when wishing still helped," often proves to be a 22 introduction. Fatal obstacle that prevents success in disciplines mentioned. Unfortunately, traditional aim to ignore this problem entirely. Instic. Deal the simple assertion of various while resorting to adopting ancient mullahs or even developing new it thinks he world can be contra. Even making an effort to compro one based more or less on unconsidered theorems and techniques. LL. Passed down through tradition, along a road that's been proven practice and experience under the constances. Obviously, some of this book will seem to have little to closer examination. However, one will apparent contradiction is actually misunderstanding. MTER all, magic a discipline that's in touch with toward experience and success, by technical flexibility and the willingly unconventional methods. In the end, without exception, by all leading a richer today and in the past, all rituals, meditation exercises, Konyanlili. We're concerned with trends that ones that the individual could escape here and there, but never for modem magic. Affect the magician as well. And end of this fact is often purposely magician just as they influence idea levels. Although the degree of this LLBD, AUY from case to case, it none the backdrop for every magical act. RS such as our mores and taboos seen wherever society or human ed. In particular, three core areas N are affected by such influences, and as already mentioned all three areas of concern, no proc is the magician's own. A court should be aware of this and not try, is by escaping into vague, cal explanations. The old, ironical still helped, often proves to be a fatal obstacle that prevents success in the three magical disciplines mentioned. Unfortunately, traditional magical literature tends to ignore this problem entirely. Instead, it's content with the simple assertion of various, higher laws of nature, while resorting to adopting ancient recipes and formulas or even developing new ones with which it thinks the world can be controlled, usually without even making an effort to comprehend and understand some of the more basic structures. I'd like to tread a different path here and not follow one based more or less on unquestioned and ill-considered theorems and techniques that have been passed down through tradition. Instead, we will travel along a road that's been proven through year-long practice and experience under the most diverse circumstances. Obviously, some of what will be said in this book will seem to have little to do with what some readers might imagine traditional magic to be. After closer examination, however, one will soon see that this apparent contradiction is actually nothing but a simple misunderstanding. MTER all, magic takes pride in being a discipline that's in touch with reality and oriented toward experience and success, characterized above all by technical flexibility and the willingness to integrate unconventional methods. In the end, and this is proven without exception by all leading authors of magic literature today and in the past, all equipment, formulas, rituals, meditation exercises, conjurations, talismans, amulets, instruments, and the like are nothing but tools to aid the magician only until he is able to master a less extravagant yet equally effective approach. Tradition as a hindrance. The traditionalism that often prevails in magic tends to push this fact into the background, a fact that applies to all human activities, not just magic. The human brain works in this manner, since it is continually occupied with developing routines or fixed procedures in order to free up some of its limited processing capacity. Whether we're learning to walk, swim, ride a bicycle, or drive a car, with more and more practice, a considerable part of these activities eventually becomes unconscious automatisms. The techniques of traditional magic are unfortunately no exception. Maybe I should explain what I mean when I say, unfortunately. At first glance, there seems to be nothing wrong with being able to perform activities that are often repeated with less and less extravagance. If a person driving a car were to concentrate on every single motion of the hand like a student driver during the first driving lesson, thinking about whether the motion is correct or incorrect, the person probably wouldn't make it too far. Others along the way might be endangered in the process, not to mention the driver personally. But we shouldn't forget that magic is a simple, everyday activity that can be smoothly integrated into our usual routines. MTER all, magic is about accomplishing things and triggering or preventing events that, according to 24 Introduction, prevailing scientific and social opiarmons, accomplished in a usual way. As magicians are out to accomplish LBLE, they rebel by definition against the thing possible that we describe with the world. It should therefore come that when the critics of magic of life, they might come from snide, L.J. fluid, LL undertaking as Operation Megaloi UE the conventional, non-magical point this label as a completely rational avowal. Lil mentioned in another work, magic, doing the impossible. One magic is not kind of physics or a science that hasn't yet. It is a true act of doing the unheen 11 feet 11 done before yes, even the sacrilegious. It should be no wonder that traditio Errolly doesn't take much interest in this. It takes a more enlightened approach nature and the entire world itself, Ho 411, that man has yet to uncover, which doesn't display. But as opposed T30, be able to D1 discover some of these high natural laws, though with tional methods, e.g., visionary, and to make practical use of the infoegil. A first glance might give the IM 1. Freighter U. D. Ice Magic. First Insights, Bad 6, Characters. Edition Magus, 1996. And the like are nothing but tools only until he is able to master a less underscore OO and an effective approach. Item as a hindrance that often prevails in magic tends to the background, a fact that applies, ties, not just magic. The human manner, since it is continually OCCU. IPJG routines are fixed procedures in of its limited processing capacity. Mean to walk, swim, ride a bicycle, or in more practice, a considerable ITIC. S eventually becomes unconscious techniques of traditional magic or 3 characters acception. Explain what I mean when I say first glance. There seems to be no LNTG able to perform activities that are less and less extravagance. If a per were to concentrate on every single like a student driver during the first IW L King about whether the motion is the person probably wouldn't make along the way might be endangered in to mention the driver personally. But T that magic is a simple, everyday be smoothly integrated into our usual magic is about accomplishing things TX preventing events that, according to on T, prevailing scientific and social opinions could never be accomplished in a usual way. As magicians are out to accomplish the impossible, they rebel by definition against the sum of everything possible that we describe with the generic term, the world. It should therefore come as no surprise that when the critics of magic, regardless of what walk of life they might come from, snidely label such an undertaking as Operation Megalomania. Indeed, the conventional, non-magical point of view regards this label as a completely rational evaluation. As I've mentioned in another work, magic can be defined as doing the impossible. One magic is not simply a shady kind of physics or a science that hasn't been recognized yet. It is a true act of doing the unheard of, the never done before, yes, even the sacrilegious. It should be no wonder that traditional magic generally doesn't take much interest in this outlook. Instead, it takes a more enlightened approach by believing that nature and the entire world itself hold many secrets that man has yet to uncover, which science certainly doesn't dispute. But as opposed to science, it claims to be able to discover some of these hidden or undiscovered natural laws, though with generally unconventional methods, e.g., visionary clairvoyance, ritual, etc., and to make practical use of the information obtained. A first glance might give the impression that ratio 1. Freighter U. D. Ice Magic. First Insights, Bad Meistereifel, Germany. Edition Magus, 1996. Part L. Money in its true element, 25 null science and metaphysical magic may seem to have irreconcilable differences in this regard. But if you take a closer look, they share the same worldview. MTER all, conventional magic works within the principle of what is possible too. regardless of the fact that the definition of what is possible is a bit more flexible and liberal than rational scientists might see it. However, both agree on the fact that there's only one world out there, and that it can be explored in a wide variety of ways. I don't want to start a debate about ideologies here, so let's just remember one pragmatic remark from everything said above. If you can view magic as being the act of doing the impossible, it just may result in higher success rates when applied to the field of money magic than with more conventional approaches. In the end, each person should make a personal judgment about that. The true element of money. If we view money in consideration of the above, it would seem quite logical to allocate it to the element of earth. When money is associated with concepts such as value, security, making a living, and protection from need, it is imperative to view it as the embodiment of earthly qualities. This is especially true when money only or even just primarily is understood as a means for purchasing land, property, or mineral resources, gemstones, precious metals, or 26 Introduction. But this coin has a flip side really explained why he diverged norm in categorizing the coins in meant of air. His omitance was to look into the matter after Riedel first time. Let's begin by establishing tics and features of modum deus to understand the French massal. I, it to the element of air. First of are much more voluminous, be able. Money's nature is more in since only through exchange can value. This holds true for even the precious metals. In other words, money can nated purpose when it changes for his or her part, must have a money's transferred value, can be thus the acquisition of the mo at a dead end. This is the flow of in services it has been used until the transaction is made. One could view this lack of form of abstraction. Thus the I, part 1, Mosh's magic may seem to have in this regard. But if you take the same worldview, MTER all, within the principle of what of the fact that the definition, more flexible and liberal than see it. However, both agree on one world out there, and that variety of ways. A debate about ideologies here, one pragmatic remark from, if you can view magic as being, DPC greater than S Cybele, it just may result in applied to the field of money. See conventional approaches. In the Make a Personal Judgment 111 Ent of Money. Consideration of the above, it to allocate it to the element of associated with concepts such a living, and protection from view it as the embodiment of. But this coin has a flip side as well. Pappas never really explained why he diverged from the conventional norm in categorizing the coins in the tarot to the element of air. His omitance was reason enough for me to look into the matter after reading his works for the first time. Let's begin by establishing some of the characteristics and features of modern-day money that will enable us to understand the French master's categorization of it to the element of air. First of all, money is generally quite mobile, a term that doesn't only mean that it consolidates the high exchange value of other goods that are much more voluminous, bulky, and less transport-able. Money's nature is more in the way of exchange, since only through exchange can money reveal its true value. This holds true for even the rarest coins made of precious metals. In other words, money can only fulfill its designated purpose when it changes hands. The new owner, for his or her part, must have a guarantee that the money's transferred value can be exchanged further, thus the acquisition of the monetary value cannot stop at a dead end. This is the flow of money as we know it today, the never-ending circulation and exchange of an item of value which has no relation to the goods and services it has been exchanged for, which cannot be used until the transaction is made. One could view this lack of reference as an extreme form of abstraction. Thus, the concept of cashless payment becoming increasingly widespread today merely represents the logical development from this first abstraction. Humans are the only living creature known to have developed this specific form of social interaction. However, it could also be said that people often expect way too much from this logical process. Even in the age of the internet and global networking, of computerized workstations and communication that relies increasingly on the exchange of digital data, most POPLE still have trouble making the connection from this abstraction back to everyday, tangible, earth element, life. For example, the charging of outrageous interest rates was considered to be abominable even in biblical times, and the entire Islamic world was always tied up in various intellectual and financial acrobatics trying to avoid the ban on charging interest as defined by the Quran in an attempt to devoutly follow the commandments of their religion. In the same sense, a considerable part of Western society has always had little understanding of the fact that financial speculations, a relatively unproductive activity, are generally much more lucrative than the production of tangible goods. The more capacity for abstract thinking an active ITY requires, the better that activity is generally paid. And since our networked, global economy increasingly encourages the further abstraction of value and pure chasing power, more and more people will become eco. 28 Introduction. Nomically insignificant in the or who cannot keep up with this. When viewed from this pane, notice the fundamental paradigm taking place for quite some time, dominantly earthy concept of value closely tied to the element of air. Is a metaphor, as Canadian media Shal McLuhan once said. All of the criteria of the principle of air, extreme agility of money, its brief, its tireless journey around the world, the exchange process that it mental nature, free from emotion, allows it to penetrate nearly every without any type of actual tie, false in a materialistic sense. 3. Each example shows the main symbolism and the language it speaketh to incorporate its diversity and automatically dooming us to failure dictions that inevitably result. To illustrate this point, using of the following exercise is recommended widespread today, merely repra, ident from this first abstraction. Living creature known to have form of social interaction. Also be said that people often from this logical process, even in global networking, of the charging of outrageous interest to be abominable even in Bibli, KC, Ru, U and financial acrobatics try on charging interest as defined by Malemp to devoutly follow the religion. In the same sense, a IWV Eastern society has always had little fact that financial speculations, IJIOCTL, ye activity are generally much the production of tangible goods. For abstract thinking and active are that activity is generally paid. RKED, global economy increasingly abstraction of value and pure, and more people will become economically insignificant in the process, especially those who cannot keep up with this virtualization of value. When viewed from this perspective, one can clearly notice the fundamental paradigm shift that has been taking place for quite some time now, from a predominantly earthy concept of value to one that is more closely tied to the element of air. After all, money is a metaphor, as Canadian media researcher Shal McLuhan once said. All of this, however, fulfills the criteria of the principle of air, the lightness and extreme agility of money, its brief stay with each owner, its tireless journey around the world, the abstraction of the exchange process that it embodies, and its fundamental nature, free from emotion and subjectivity, that allows it to penetrate nearly every aspect of human life without any type of actual participation. Let me emphasize once again, in our classification of the elements, there is no objective true or objective false in a materialistic sense. Because, as our earlier beach example shows, the main advantage of elemental symbolism and the language it speaks is that it allows us to incorporate its diversity and flexibility without automatically dooming us to failure from any contradictions that inevitably result. To illustrate this point using a practical example, the following exercise is recommended. Exercise. Review the beach scene described earlier. Let the statements about each element and its various manifestations really sink in before proceeding to the next step. Categorize the scene as a whole to one single element and give reasons for your decision. Write down the element you chose and make note of the reasons for your choice. Now select another basic element, excluding ether for now, and develop convincing arguments for why the whole scene could belong to the symbolism of that element. Why can the scene described be primarily categorized as belonging to the element of water or earth, for example? Please note, the goal here is not to determine which element is correct or more correct than the others. Don't let yours get distracted by such notions. Instead, try to envision the scene and describe it as comprehensively and in as much detail as possible. Once you've categorized the scene with one element, repeat the procedure with the remaining ones. Conditioned reflexes come automatically, so watch out. We're not concerned with determining the best or most accurate element to describe the beach scene. Nonetheless, the choice is not arbitrary. Water cannot randomly be replaced by fire, for example, and air describes such a complexity of factors that could never cover the element of earth, and so on. Later on we'll pick up this exercise again and wrap it up. 30 Introduction. The contradiction mentioned in simple terms as the tension that Aristotle shocked face LJ between chasing after money for all it. Stanley hearing that money can't buy in turn makes money into an object in the beach scene exercise. But ILCN, LLLLL warning, it's common practice in dismiss anything too complex or in things like, it's all relative, as ization could truly be of any help into various perspectives. Here in the Asian, there's generally nothing left acknowledge that everything is in freeing us from all obligation wahing is really true anyway. This RB our thought process as well. In Kaun Geol choose the path of least resistance. It certainly would be magic to not get hung up on obstacle of resistance. Ultimately, this shish form of a mere temporary work, the magician not allowing such the first place. Another approach to the beetle, FLLL size, regarding its elemental K2UIIA, L, PMMONH, HS. Its VTZTO, R manifestations really sync T and next MP. As a whole to one single element, decision. Write down the element of TLX reasons for your choice. Basic element, excluding ether for LLLLLRRI, 7U. Ing arguments for why the whole. Ism of that element. Why can merely categorized as belonging to F? Earth, for example? Pi here is not to determine which E correct than the others. Don't let such notions, instead, try to envision a loss comprehensively and in as much Z the scene with one element, the remaining ones come automatically, so watch out. With determining the best or most describe the beach scene. None the arbitrary. Water cannot randomly, for example, and air describes such that could never cover the LA so on. Later on we'll pick up this, wrap it up. L. The contradiction mentioned above can be described in simple terms as the tension that arises when we're torn between chasing after money for all it's worth and constantly hearing that money can't buy happiness, which in turn makes money into an object of contempt. But as the previous exercise has shown, we just might be able to rob this contradiction of its effective power. After all, as money magicians we can describe and deal with our personal relationship to money like in the beach scene exercise. But here's a little advance warning. It's common practice in every culture to dismiss anything too complex or ambivalent by saying things like, it's all relative, as though this realization could truly be of any help. By putting things into various perspectives, here in the sense of devaluation, there's generally nothing left in the end but to acknowledge that everything is interchangeable, thus freeing us from all obligation whatsoever. Since no thing is really true anyway, this arbitrary attitude invades our thought process as well, encouraging us to always choose the path of least resistance. Well, it certainly would be advantageous in money magic to not get hung up on obstacles or other types of resistance. Ultimately, this should not occur in the form of a mere temporary workaround, but rather in the magician not allowing such resistance to build in the first place. Another approach to the beach observation exercise, regarding its elemental categorization, would be to not search at all for the equal values of these opinions or interpretations. Naturally, one element or the other will seem more plausible and convincing to you than the rest, which you picked only because the exercise required you to do so. That's perfectly okay. Our goal here is not to convince you of the triviality and invalidity of your viewpoint, but rather to solidify your position and make it binding by means of examining as many alternatives as possible. But if we are serious in our attempt of the monstrous crime of doing the impossible, we cannot avoid such binding commitment. In a world where the possible does its utmost to obstruct this undertaking, such non-committal fluctuation and every willingness to compromise would be equal to capitulation. Money's true element, the oldest form of magic passed down from ancient times, is theurgy. The word itself can be loosely translated as divine coercion, although this does not refer to the coercion that the gods or immortals put on man, but rather just the opposite. A theurgist is a human magician who dares to coerce the gods. Even without any knowledge of the ancient authors, it is not difficult to imagine that this didn't sit particularly well with the representatives of conventional religions. Theurgists were considered to be socially inferior, and people often accused them of provoking the gods with their wicked deeds, causing the gods to lash out at the entire community. Anyone caught in the process of performing 32 Introduction. Such wanton acts was subject to, as was the case in ancient Rome. Witch hunts of the late Middle Times were not rooted in Christi, can deduce that such things human inclination to eliminate thing that threatens the structin, dices, envy, jealousy, petty bow, narrow-mindedness that one L.I.B.S.T. Well, methods and interests shifted throughout the mill dance, at least in the Western, be afraid that they might end up stake, other forms of chastise. Our spirit of insubordination has history, continuing our tendency. Explanations used for describing ity. I'd like to apply a small potion here myself for the dura of money magic. In all bias in time honored school of thought rise money only to the element ing another thought on the also, j other elements as well. I, L, J, I, part T moxin, J, Lucille and convincing to you picked only because the Xer. So that's perfectly 0k. Arc weak. EU of the triviality and T, but rather to solidify your L Dingby means of examining as L. In our attempt of the man impossible, we cannot avoid T. In a world where the passive struck this undertaking, such seed passed down from ancient Liquidioi. D itself can be loosely trans, although this does not refer gods or immortals put on man, ite. A theurgist is a human coerce the gods. Even without underscore. 7. Characters. End authors. It is not difficult to sit particularly well with the ancient religions. Theurgists socially inferior, and people often Iden the gods with their wicked to lash out at the entire community in the process of performing such wanton acts was subject to punishment by death, as was the case in ancient Rome, for example. Thus, the witch hunts of the late Middle Ages and early modern times were not rooted in Christianity alone. Instead, we can deduce that such things were based on a general human inclination to eliminate everyone and everything that threatens the structure of superstition, prejudices, envy, jealousy, petty bourgeois conformism, and narrow-mindedness that one likes to call culture. Well, methods and interests have changed and shifted throughout the millenniums. Modern Magians, at least in the Western world, have no reason to be afraid that they might end up being burned at the stake, other forms of chastisement notwithstanding. Our spirit of insubordination has remained throughout history, continuing our tendency to reject conventional explanations used for describing and creating our real ity. I'd like to apply a small portion of this insubordinity on here myself for the duration of our examination of money magic. In all biasness and against every time honored school of thought, I'm going to categorize money only to the element of air without wasting another thought on the possibility that it might fit other elements as well. Part 2. The Wings of Mercury. The fleeting god of merchants and thieves. In conjunction with the magical process of categorization, not only is close study of the elements necessary but also a closer look at the symbolism of the planetary principles. The tradition of the planetary principles is a bit more unanimous than that of the elements when it comes to classifying money. Generally, money is ascribed to planet Mercury, although the Venus principle may also be applied at times, especially in connection with its relationship to trading and swapping, albeit in an ancillary function. The Jupiter principle finds use here as well. It relates to prosperity, wealth, abundance, and generosity on a general level. In order to better understand the planetary principles, a look at mythology might help. After all, we're talking about the symbolic representatives of deities, and tradition provides us with plenty of information. 35 on this. As a side note, allocating money to Mercury is another argument in favor of identifying it with the element of air, since Mercury is also the god of quicksilver and the messenger god with winged feet, who in turn is also the god of merchants and thieves. As differentiating and discriminating as the polytheistic pantheon always is, it is nonetheless comprised of personalized human elements and represents a sort of map of universal powers and relationship networks. As opposed to the monotheistic God who embodies only the good, evil is left to subordinate charges. The deities of polytheism make no distinction between good and evil. The two concepts often mix, the borders are fluid and indefinable, and contradictions are allowed to exist without the compulsion to resolve them. Thus, the figure of Mercury can be found in the most diverse contexts, whereby it should make no difference as to whether we are dealing with the Roman god Mercurius or his direct forerunner, the Greek god Hermes. It is not uncommon that the gods are sometimes difficult to distinguish from one another when it comes to their motives and actions. Although various features and characteristics have been accentuated throughout history, the essence is always one and the same. For example, it makes perfect sense to ascribe Mercury Hermes to the ancient Egyptian god Thoth, Tahuti, although he was originally a moon deity. This correspondence can be explained by the fact that 36 Introduction. Thoth is considered to be the in language, and because he is known spirits of the dead on their journey as a sort of counselor. Hermes, meaning someone who guides world, has similar duties. This brings us back to the tarot, in its magical esoteric interpret, the Book of Thoth. Traditional magic, with its Egyptian roots, is generally used distinctions between terms such as information, education, intellect. Curie principle can stand for the as well as every other cognitive way. It can also symbolize wisdom. Its ESOTERIC practical application in 4 characters. Act 10n. In any case, I recommend it when examining mythology 1. Able, with even just a small m browsing through such literature, find something to substantiate might hold. And during your beer that myths are not meant to type documents of historical events. Be viewed as general, abstract within certain contexts. In this, Mercury and his astrological part IHH, 01 note. Allocating money to Mercury T in favor of identifying it with the Mercury is also the god of quick LLL. L and E are god with winged feet, who and of merchants and thieves. LLLLLTLLLG, and discriminating as the poly always is, it is nonetheless comprised, Uranian elements and represents a sort, powers and relationship networks. Monotheistic god who embodied is left to sub. Or in Tay charges. ETSM make no D1STMCT10N between F2 concepts often mix, the Bohr indefinable, and contradictions are without the compulsion to resolve of Mercury can be found in the ILIPB. XTs, whereby it should make no differ we are dealing with the Roman his direct forerunner, the Greek god uncommon that the gods are some distinguished from one another when motives and actions. Although vari characteristics have been accentuated, the essence is always one and the it makes perfect sense to ascribe to the ancient Egyptian god Thoth. He was originally a moon deity. CE can be explained by the fact that Thoth is considered to be the inventor of writing and language, and because he is known to accompany the spirits of the dead on their journey to the underworld as a sort of counselor. Hermes, the Greek psychopomp, meaning someone who guides spirits to the other world, has similar duties. This brings us back to the tarot cards again, which, in its magical esoteric interpretation, is often called the Book of Thoth. Traditional magic, with its classical and ancient Egyptian roots, is generally unfamiliar with the fine distinctions between terms such as knowledge, wisdom, information, education, intellect, and mind. The Mercury principle can stand for the thought process itself as well as every other cognitive process. In the same way, it can also symbolize wisdom, life experience, and its resulting practical application in the form of magical action. In any case, I recommend that you don't overdo it when examining mythological information available. With even just a small amount of effort put into browsing through such literature, sooner or later you'll find something to substantiate any viewpoint you might hold. And during your research, also remember that myths are not meant to be treated as objective documents of historical events. Instead, they should be viewed as general, abstract principles as expressed within certain contexts. In this sense, a deity such as Mercury and his astrological correspondence, the planet of the same name, represents a sort of general outlook of the world that should never be too distinct or restricting its sphere of influence should remain as great as possible. Religious and political conflicts. The subject of gods and deities in classical magic deserves a bit more attention here. In magical practice, there are often a lot of basic misunderstandings which derive from the society in which we live. Understand ably, a person born and raised in a monotheistic culture will generally have difficulties with the basic concept of polytheism, regardless of the fact that our culture has been undergoing a steady expansion of atheist and agnostic ideas for a good 200 years or so. The roots of this lack of comprehension may possibly lie much further back in history. In particular, the development of Mosaism, Judaism, and Islam offers sufficient proof of the incredible force that monotheistic religions felt they needed to apply to assert themselves against the then predominantly polytheistic environment. The Islamic creed, "There is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his prophet," is still pronounced millions of times around the world every day. Even in the days of the Old Testament, religious leaders had their hands full keeping their tribes away from the metaphysical temptations of their polytheistic environments, as the story of the dance around the golden calf illustrates. Even the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten, who according to the present state of research can be considered. 38 Introduction. The inventor of monotheism had to enforce his religious revolution, albeit only for the relatively short. Shortly after the pharaoh died, the cult he introduced disappeared. The development of moneth less than painted by strong political Akhenaten's was mainly concerned power of the priests of Thebes and high-based political centralism that will for more political power again. The Jewish faith formed original tribes who followed Moses and worship of Yahweh had to endure conflicts throughout the years in political recognition, and such one today, as any authority on Israel in. Even Pauline Christianity was becoming the Roman state occurred shortly before Constantine's centuries of bloody persecution. However, Constantine's successor, the defector, returned to pre-theistic paganism. If his reign a few more years, the history of might have turned out very difficult. These political references they might help bridge the gap of exists between monotheistic and I. Part 2 th. Wo 1. 1 name represents a sort of general sphere of influence should rem as rid t never be too distinct in political conflicts. Gods and deities in classical magic bore attention here. In magical practice, a lot of basic misunderstandings which society in which we live. You and raised in a monotheistic culture have difficulties with the basic concept regardless of the fact that our culture in a steady expansion of atheists and for a good 200 years or so. The of comprehension may possibly lie back in history. In particular, the Judaism, and Islam offers suf needed to apply to assert themselves predominantly polytheistic environment creed. There is no God but Allah and his prophet, is still pronounced millions the world every day. Even in the days, LBL meant, religious leaders had their hands, bear tribes away from the metaphysical their polytheistic environments, as the around the golden calf illustrates. Heretic pharaoh Akhenaten, who accord state of research can be considered CTION. The inventor of monotheism had to use extreme brutal to enforce his religious revolution in ancient Egypt, albeit only for the relatively short term of his reign. Shortly after the pharaoh died, the monotheistic sun cult he introduced disappeared. The development of monotheism is always accompanied by strong political and economical upheaval. Akhenaten was mainly concerned with dissolving the power of the priests of Thebes and introducing a cult-based political centralism that would give the pharaoh more political power again. The Jewish faith formed originally from the Vari tribes who followed Moses and Abraham in their worship of Yahweh, had to endure countless military conflicts throughout the years in order to establish its political recognition, and such conflicts still continue today, as any authority on Israel and Palestine knows. Even Pauline Christianity was preoccupied with becoming the Roman state religion, which finally occurred shortly before Constantine's death, following centuries of bloody persecution. There were setbacks, however. Constantine's successor Julian the Apostate, the defector, returned supremacy to ancient polytheistic paganism. If his reign would have lasted just a few more years, the history of Western civilization might have turned out very differently. These political references are mentioned here because they might help bridge the gap of misunderstanding that exists between monotheistic and pagan polytheistic cultures. This ongoing conflict is intensified by the wave of religiously critical skepticism that sprouted early in modern history, a trend that peaked with the French encyclopedic scholars of the Age of Enlightenment and again later during the 19th century, which was marked by the Industrial Revolution, the advancement of science, and Darwinism. When this wave of skepticism began to fix its eye on religion, it was confronted almost exclusively with monotheistic Christianity, at least in Europe. It is significant to note that rationalism argues a similar position today as Christianity did thousands of years ago in regards to pagan polytheism. Belief is something that needs to be overcome and is degraded to a mere expression of hopeless ignorance or superstition, which is argumentatively backed up against a wall with all kinds of pedantry and alleged proof of its fundamental, untenable nature. Germania's conversion to Christianity occurred in a similar fashion. When St. Boniface felled Sul, the holy tree of the Germanic tribes, he did this as proof of his God's omnipotence. This act was staged as a huge event in which representatives of the subdued tribes were forced to look on as this sacrilege was committed against their faith, and to endure terrible mockery in the process because their God didn't send down a lightning bolt to prevent such an act of humiliation. At least that's what the legends say. The fact that St. Boniface only dared to carry out his operation under 40 introduction. Massive military protection is Rardal. It was more of a demonstration of took several generations before it solidate Christian Franconian manic soil. The fact that St. Boni BC, LL among the Frisian tribes during his airy activities supports this as well. Therefore, it should come as human beings living in modem find a deeper understanding for the ICS of polytheism. Our only info hearsay in a watered-down form, one church's worship of saints, or in practices of some foreign cultures. In this sense, it poses a bit of a magic to intrigue gods from an intercultural relationship to such Sean lines have been destroyed for mental basis for existence since it's the suppression, or conquest, of modern magic. The past stirs of phi gives rise to the concept of a less than replaces the dimension of real TXJJCDL. Before examining the planetary mately lead us to the ritual CTIC, E111 the next chapter, we should be that are in action here, aye.
Greetings. Thank you for tuning in. Please do remember to like and subscribe, and we'll catch you guys in the next video.